This is Ask Me Anything. This week we're talking about what came first, questions about where did God come from, or what made God, or can we argue for the existence of God? I'm John Topping. This is Ask Me Anything. I'm an apologist for the Ultimate Questions apologetics team with Power to Change students. I'm also a teacher at Master's College in Peterborough. I teach philosophy, ethics, and apologetics. So if you're interested in having one of our speakers come, like myself or someone else on the team, come and speak at your university group, your college group, your youth group, your church, just get a hold of us and we'd love to do something like that. So we're going to dive right in. First up is the question of, can faith in God be rational? Is that the sort of thing that we can actually argue for? And largely today, we see many people today just assuming that belief in God is just a faith thing. There's no evidence for it. There's no reason to believe in God. So believing God is actually kind of irrational. When really, if we look at all of human history, for the vast majority of human history, all human beings believed in God. There were no atheists. So you look at philosophers and scientists throughout the ages, they always just said it looks obvious to us that something like God exists. Xenophanes was an early skeptic of religion, Greek philosopher, and he was basically mocked religion in his writings. He said things like, oh yeah, we Greeks, we have our gods, and what do you know, our gods are white. You go to Africa, what do you know, their gods are black. If horses had gods, they'd be horse gods, right? Kind of mocking the idea that we create God in our own image, and just religion is kind of silly, was a large point that he made. However, this early critic of religion still said, seems obvious that there's something like God though, right? So let's talk about what he actually is. Said that it just seems like there has to be some sort of all-powerful force outside of the universe that brings things about. Philosophically, the philosophers always came back to there had to be something supreme. There had to be something over everything else that brings everything into existence. And atheism, like I said, is actually a fairly recent development. The earliest atheist writings that we see are probably in 1674 AD. So it's a very recent sort of phenomenon where all of human history has been theistic, believing in God. Ultimately, the question of what came first, or what is the source of everything, or what causes things, that question has always been answered as being God. And it's only a fairly recent development where people have actually tried to give reasons for those things. Of what's the source or what's causes things. It's only very recently that people have been trying to give scientific reasons for that through things like quantum physics. And largely, the work that's being done there is largely science fiction. When people try to use this stuff to say, oh no, we found a source for all of existence outside of God. There is no God. We can explain where everything came from just through quantum physics. Really, it's extremely theoretical with no evidence backing it up. These ideas that the universe just spontaneously came about. It's largely science fiction at this point. It's ad hoc reasoning. It's saying we don't want to have to believe in God, so let's come up with an excuse that doesn't have any reason behind it, but that we can use to justify our beliefs. And so then, coming out of that, saying that atheism doesn't really have any support to it, is it possible to argue that God does exist? Is that possible? Can you prove that God exists? I think one thing to comment on first, when people ask, can you prove that God exists? I think it's important to note there that when we argue about these things, we're not asking for a proof or certainty. We're asking to just find what's the best explanation of the data that we have on hand. So just as an example of this, I've given people reason to believe in God before, and I've given them an argument, and they've said, yeah, but you haven't proven it to me. I can still doubt that. It's like, you want like something that you can't doubt, something that's certain, something that is so proven true that you actually can't doubt it. Then you're asking for something that science can't even provide, because science doesn't provide certainty. That's just the nature of it. It's done using inductive reasoning. So you can't arrive at certain truth. So if people are asking for an argument for God, that you can prove it with certainty, that's just an unreasonable sort of request. You wouldn't request that even of a scientist. So why are you requesting that for something like theology? When we do argumentation in anything, we typically use abductive reasoning. What's the best explanation of the data? When we get all of our evidence together and we try to formulate arguments and reasons and critique each other and come to a conclusion, we're saying, what's the best explanation we can find? That's the real attempt here, and that's what we do, and that's what we use to show that God exists. And so the better question to ask would be, can you give an argument for the existence of God? And to that I say, absolutely. People have been doing that for over 2,000 years. I have heard people, every now and then, I've heard an atheist make a claim like, you can't argue for the existence of God, or there are no arguments for the existence of God. And I think that sort of thing just comes largely out of ignorance, just ignorance of history, ignorance of philosophy. There are lots of arguments for God's existence. There have been lots of arguments for God's existence for over 2,000 years. So one argument that we can go into, when we look at just Big Bang cosmology today, and we go backwards and we try to think of where everything came from, everybody agrees today the universe had a beginning. There was a point in which the universe didn't exist. And so it's the universe just, it had a beginning. We all recognize that at this point. Even time, we recognize, had a beginning point, as odd as that sounds. Science, philosophy, everybody agrees that the universe began. There's very few people today that would say the universe is literally eternal. So it's just and to follow that, it's just a logical statement to say something like, if something begins, it had a cause of its existence. If something starts existing, then something else brought it about. To show that there's just nothing in existence that causes itself. Something else has to bring the thing about. You can't be your own parent, right? So if something begins, something else has to bring it about. And so from that, it's just reasonable to say that if the universe began to exist, then something outside of the universe had to cause the universe to come into existence. And so we call that God. And so the obvious next question that immediately comes up whenever this is brought up is, why does that have to be God? Yeah, sure, the universe had a beginning, something outside of the universe had to bring it about. Why does that have to be God? So then we say, let's just take a moment to think about what kind of a thing it is that brings about the universe. First of all, the thing that brings about the universe, because it's outside the universe, can't be made of matter, energy, or be within space. It can't be those things, because those things are part of the universe. It also can't be within time, because time had a beginning and time is part of the universe. It also can't follow the physical laws, because the physical laws are something that come about when the universe does. It also has to be something that's incredibly powerful, because it brings about the universe, right? If it's bringing about literally everything, that's an incredibly impressive feat. So if we do an analysis here and say, what's the sort of thing that would be outside of time, outside of space, not made of matter or energy, doesn't follow any of the physical laws? That just sounds like God, right? But we can go even a step further than that. What would it mean for something to cause something to happen when that thing isn't made of matter or energy and doesn't follow physical laws and isn't within time? What is making that thing cause stuff? If it's not within time and it doesn't follow physical laws and it's not made of stuff, how could anything make it do something? The only real possible explanation is that the thing chooses to act, chooses to bring something about, a will to act. If nothing is causally forcing the thing to do it, and yet it still does it, it seems like there would have to be a will to act, which would be a mind. So we have an incredibly powerful mind that exists out of time, outside of time and space, and isn't made of matter and energy. That just sounds like God, right? So that conclusion just logically follows out of the sorts of things that we all agree upon. It's not an issue of there's a God of the gaps, as though we can't explain certain things, so God must have done it. Instead, it's saying, let's just look at the evidence that we have. What logically flows out of that is that God exists, using deductive reasoning of all things, showing that the conclusion has to be true. We all agree on the premises, and the conclusion follows logically. And this is why all philosophers and scientists throughout history recognize there has to be something that is outside of the universe that brings the universe about. And that's why it's only very recently that real atheism has started. And that's why I make the claim atheism is not scientifically founded. There's no scientific argument that shows that there's no such thing as God or gives us reason to do that. I would say that atheism is actually the result of cultural bias, and it uses science to try to justify itself. So the question then, I don't get asked this question too often, but I do every now and then in my philosophy class, is where did atheism come from then? If it's not being arrived at through rationality and reason and argument and evidence, which most people think it is, where did it come from then? Oftentimes we get the question or the challenge, prove to me that God exists, right? Show me that God exists. And the problem is you have no reason to be an atheist. There is no argument for atheism. There's no rationality or evidence behind that. But really where atheism came from is when the scientific method was really starting to be used in a more rigid way, where real science, what we would call science today, really started was in the late 1500s, basically. And during this time, the scientific method, doing science, means finding a naturalistic explanation, finding a physical cause of why things are the way they are. And so this naturalism that they were using to do science was just in method. They were using naturalism as a method to try to understand the way the world works. So we call that methodological naturalism, using naturalism as a method in order to do science. As an example here, when you're doing a test in your lab, you just assume no angels are messing with your results. There's not an angel grabbing the test tubes and mixing them up and confusing you or something. You just make that assumption before you even begin. I'm going to assume there's no supernatural entities interfering here. We're going to come up with a completely naturalistic explanation for the way things are. So that's using naturalism as a method. What ended up happening is methodological naturalism led to philosophical naturalism. In other words, they used naturalism as a method to arrive at scientific conclusions, and then they just said, hey, let's run with this. And it just led to a cultural bias of, let's try to understand everything on naturalism, which there was no reason to do that. There was no argument to do that. It was just taking a good idea and running too far with it. There was no evidence or argumentation. It was just falling down a slippery slope. And this naturalism that took over the community led to deism, where they said, yeah, God exists. We still all believe in God, but we recognize he doesn't really do anything now because we're coming up with naturalistic explanations for everything. So yeah, God made the universe, but he doesn't really do anything now. And then that leads them to saying, well, you know what? We live our lives as though we're atheists, and we're just kind of using God as an excuse to start the thing off. Let's just recognize the fact that we're atheists. They didn't arrive there through evidence or argumentation or reasoning or through science. Science didn't do anything to show that God didn't exist. It was largely just a cultural phenomena by bias leading them there. And so what happens in this early movement where science is getting started is a guy named David Hume writes against the supernatural. He writes against miracles. And through his arguments, a lot of people become convinced of philosophical naturalism, that there is no such thing as God. And that's what gives atheism its foundation for today. Even to the point that today, atheists will hear arguments for God and arguments for Christianity, and they'll say, you know what, that's a really good argument, but Hume did a really good job destroying the supernatural. So then let's look at a few of the arguments that Hume gave to try to defeat the supernatural and miracles. The first one is that there can't be any miracles because miracles go against our experience. In other words, we just don't see miracles today. Miracles just don't happen. So why should we think they happen if we just don't observe them? Problem is, if you get a large enough sample size, if you ask enough people, you will get miracle stories. And they will be incredibly improbable, and they will be very difficult to explain. You just do get miracle stories if you ask enough people. So to say they go against our experience, one of two things happened. Either he didn't ask enough people, because if he did, you would get miracle stories, or he asked people, they gave him miracle stories, and he just wrote them off as if they didn't exist. So you're either ignoring data, or you're not getting enough data, both of which are problematic. But it gets worse than that. One of Hume's other arguments is he said, if you hear a miracle claim, or you believe you've seen a miracle, you are always more rational to believe that you have been mistaken. the problem is that's a fallacy. That's called circular reasoning or begging the question. That's assuming your conclusion before you go into the argument. It's saying, you know what, you're making this claim. I'm just going to assume that you're wrong. Well, there's no reason to do that, right? You can't say, I'm always more reasonable to believe that the miracle is false. No, that's what we're arguing about, is whether miracles happen. So you can't just assume your position. And the next argument falls prey to the same problem. He says, no amount of evidence can convince us of miracles because miracles are so improbable. In other words, he's saying, I'm not even willing to look at the evidence, is what he's saying. He admits that. I'm not even willing to look at the evidence because it's just so improbable, I just assume it's the sort of thing that can't happen. That's assuming your conclusion before you argue for it. Again, that's a logical fallacy. We oftentimes today hear the claim that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, right? That's kind of a catchphrase that's passed around today. The problem is the way that sounds very reasonable, but the problem is the way it practically works out is if you give evidence for the supernatural, the person says, man, that's not enough. So they don't actually even look at the evidence. They don't respond to the argument. They just shrug it off. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. When really, I think the more rational and reasonable claim, the more reasonable position to hold would be any claim demands sufficient evidence. If you make a claim, you have to back it up. And if somebody backs up their claim, you have to deal with it. You have to respond to it. You can't just say, nah, that's not good enough for me. Like, you have to actually have a reason for what you believe. And so Hume's last point was that miracles are by definition impossible. And what he said is a miracle by definition is the breaking of the laws of nature. And the laws of nature are the kinds of things that can't be broken. So again, he's arguing in a circle, right? That's a circle. The laws of nature can't be broken. Miracle is the breaking of the laws of nature. That's a circle. That's assuming your argument before you get going. That's assuming your conclusion. It's not an argument. He didn't actually give a reasonable argument. All of his arguments are either fallacious or fall prey to some horrible problem. And that's the foundation of atheism. It started as a cultural bias out of just running with the idea of naturalism, following a cultural bias, and then falling prey to really bad fallacious arguments. That's where atheism came from. And even today, there are people that, like, I remember hearing of an atheist. He saw a debate between a Christian and an atheist, and the Christian gave a really good argument for Christianity, in my opinion. I really like the resurrection argument. Look that up if you're interested. I do work on that myself. And so the Christian gives the resurrection argument, and then the atheist gives a response. And so an atheist in the crowd, an academic, says, the atheist's response to the Christian's argument was bad. The Christian gave a really good argument for Christianity. I don't know how to handle it. I don't know how to give a counter-argument to that. It seems reasonable that Christianity is true based on this man's argument. But Hume did such a good job arguing against the supernatural, I defer to Hume. But the problem is Hume's arguments were fallacious and irrational. They're not good. So atheism is built on very shaky ground. What you should do is look at the evidence that is provided for God's existence and deal with it. Actually come up with a counter-argument. Deal with it, or follow the evidence where it leads. We love saying that. We want to follow the evidence where it leads. Then become a theist, believe in God, and ultimately become a Christian because the evidence is there. We can argue for it. The next question that comes up is when we argue about these things and show that God exists, the question comes up, well, what made God? What came before God? What caused God? And this sometimes is phrased as saying, if God is the designer, and you need a designer because things are so complicated. Well, if God made the complicated stuff, then God's more complicated, so he needs a reason too. There needs to be something that caused God. So where did God come from? Which is kind of like the child's question that we get. A child comes up and says, Daddy, where did God come from? Ultimately, I think that question comes, the root of that question comes from just not understanding what words mean, ultimately. So as an example, Thomas Aquinas gave arguments for God a long time ago, and he said that God is the uncaused cause. He's the thing that causes stuff, but doesn't have a cause. He's the stopping point. When you go backwards in the chain of causes, he's the thing that brings an end to the chain so that you don't have an infinite regress. He's the uncaused cause. So then if you ask the question, well, what caused the thing that has no cause? you're just showing you don't know what the words mean, right? It's showing you don't understand the terms involved. What caused the uncaused thing? It doesn't have a cause. So asking what cause it has shows you don't know what the words mean. God is understood as being a necessary being. That he's the only thing in existence that's actually necessary, that is in existence necessarily. So then asking a question like, well, where did God come from? Is asking as though God is contingent. And you say, no, God is necessary. He's not contingent. Well, where did God come from? No, I just told you he's necessary. He's not contingent. It's a misunderstanding of the words. The basic problem is just here is misunderstanding the concept of what God is. It's like saying, oh, you know that thing that had no beginning? When did it begin? No, it's the kind of thing that didn't begin. So I think that question ultimately misses the point. It's a category error. The next thing that comes up sometimes in these discussions is, as I've shown, atheism doesn't have a rational backing to it. There's no argument giving it reason. There's no reason why atheism came about where people were arguing for it as though science brought about atheism. That didn't happen. So if there's no argument for atheism, sometimes the response that we get is, well, you can't argue for the non-existence of a thing, right? It's the job of the theist, it's the job of the Christian to argue for God's case, and then we'll respond. We can't give an argument against God because you can't argue for the non-existence of a thing. First of all, we do give arguments for God's existence, and there are no good counter-arguments. It seems as though God exists based on those arguments. So deal with those, right? But it gets worse than that because you can prove the non-existence of things. So for example, I can prove to you right now, all you're seeing is the back wall here, but I'm sitting in about a 10 by 10 room right now. I can prove to you there is no marching band in this room. It's quiet. If there was a marching band practicing in this room, it would be loud. You would be able to hear them. So you can infer there's no marching band there. You now know the non-existence of a thing. It would also not fit a marching band in here. Looking around, there's no marching band in my room right now, right? I can prove the non-existence of a thing. Also, you can prove the non-existence of things that are self-contradictory. I can prove to you that there are no married bachelors because the concept of what it means to be a bachelor is that you're not married. So a married bachelor does not exist. I can show you the non-existence of a thing logically. So also it gets even worse than that, because if the atheist tries to say, well, you can't argue for atheism because you can't prove the non-existence of a thing, then you shouldn't be an atheist. If you have absolutely no reason to believe in atheism, you can't prove it, you can't argue for it, you can't give evidence for it, then why are you an atheist? The biggest problem here, though, is that I think you can show that God does exist, and you have to actually respond to those arguments. So then the next point that comes up is, can science show that God exists? Can you use science to show that God exists? And I think you can. I think using abductive reasoning, getting the best explanation of the data, right? Gathering together all of our data and saying, what's the best explanation of this? I think the answer is God. When we look at the laws that govern the universe, all the laws in place, it really looks like there is fine-tuning there. It's called the fine-tuning argument. When you look at all the rules that govern the universe and how physical stuff behaves within itself, really looks so precisely done to bring about conscious sentient observers like ourselves. It seems like there was a deliberate attempt to bring about the kind of universe where we could exist. Just as an example here, if you change any of these rules, you don't get life. And I don't mean human life, like, oh, well, we could get aliens or something. No, I mean you don't get stars and planets. In some of these cases, if you change some of the rules, you don't get chemistry. If you don't even have chemistry, how are you going to have life? If you don't have stars and planets forming and it's just gas flying wildly out of control, not even connected to one another, how are you going to get anything that's going to look like life? Right? So all of these laws look incredibly finely tuned because they could be any number of different ways, and they're incredibly precisely oriented to bring about a universe where stars and planets form, where chemistry is possible, and ultimately where life can exist. So as an example, the gravitational force, the Higgs vacuum expectation value, the cosmological constant, if you change these, you don't get things like us. And there's all sorts of those. You can read up online yourself. There's all sorts of these laws where all of them have to be in place. All of them have to be finely tuned in order to bring about a situation where you get conscious observers. As though the situation was finely tuned because the thing that finely tuned the universe wanted conscious observers to exist. And the problem here is all of those laws that all need to be precisely calculated, they all multiply each other. So it gets multiplying and multiplying and multiplying. The numbers that we get are so astronomically huge of just the improbability of it. It's so massive. The numbers stop making sense to human minds. So the only way that we can explain the way the dials have been turned to have all the laws set in place perfectly, there only seems to be three options. I'm open to hearing more, but I've never heard a fourth option. The three options would be chance. It's incredibly improbable. There's no way you just bet on chance with a number like that. It's like winning the lottery a million times in a row. It's actually worse than that when you look at the numbers. It's hugely improbable. And so it can't be chance. You can't bet on chance. It's not an option. Or it's done by necessity. Physicists today recognize the universe does not have to be the way it is. It could have been any number of different ways, and it just happened to be this way. So it doesn't seem like it's necessity. It seems like it had many different ways it could have been. Or there's a designer. There's someone that's fixing the dials to be a certain way because the designer wants things like us to come about. And so when you hear this argument, you have to do something with it. If you just dismiss it and say, that's not good enough for me, that's a logical fallacy called moving the goalpost. Right? If you say, I defer to people like Hume that have defeated things, that's fallacious as well. Actually deal with the argument. It really looks like God exists, and that's why the vast majority of human history has been filled with people that believed in God and just recognized not just that they believed in God, that it's just obvious that God exists. It's just obvious. You look at the argumentation, there's no way around it. Right? So it's the sort of thing where I would actually say, disbelieving in God is actually an irrational thing, where the evidence is stacked against you, where you have to deal with this. It's like deliberately believing the less likely case. It's believing something that lacks argument and reason and evidence to it, and deliberately believing something that is less likely to be true. That's hugely problematic. I remember talking to a student who was doing his master's degree in the hard sciences. So I forget what field it was specifically, but it was the sort of thing when I heard it, I was like, whoo, you're smarter than me, right? And so we were talking about these things, looking at it, and he's the one that knows this data regarding the way the universe is set up. And he was looking at the data saying, you know what, I've came to this conclusion a while ago. I left the faith years ago, and I'm recognizing it's just obvious that something like God has to exist. When you look at the data, it's just obvious something like God exists. I left the faith. I don't want to have to believe this stuff. And I'm not a Christian, but it's just obvious something like God exists. And that's why we find in the Bible, in Romans 1:20, it says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, and the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." In other words, God is just so obvious. When you look at creation, you are without excuse. You should believe in God and then try to figure out, what does that mean, right? Look at the evidence for Christianity. If God exists, something is true, and there's more to life than this. And it's worth investigating and looking into and talking to people and seeing, is Christianity actually true? Is this the sort of thing where I should actually start having faith? Is that the most reasonable conclusion? I would say it is, and it's worth investigating. Now, as we're wrapping up, we had some really good questions 2 weeks ago on the problem of evil. Why does God allow suffering? A few good questions that came up after the fact. We don't have too much time to go into it today, but I'll go a little bit into it. I'll probably go a little bit over time here. But first of all, I wanted to recommend a book to you. Yup, it's backwards. I thought that would happen. Hopefully this isn't backwards. If it is, you can probably tell. It reads Why Does God Allow Evil by Clay Jones. Best book on the topic I've ever read. I've read a lot on that topic. Best book. It's written conversationally. The book is also cheap. He's not trying to get rich off this thing. It's written very, very well. It took him over 20 years to write this book. He did really good research, organized it in a way that anybody can pick up the book and really get it. And it answers a lot of the questions that we have about suffering and evil and how these things came about, why God allows this stuff. It goes really into a lot of really good answers. I strongly recommend that book. And so we're wrapping up here on a lot of these topics. This is our last week in the Ask Me Anything series. So thank you for joining us over these past 8 weeks. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you found this video helpful or any of the others, you can tag someone in the comments below or share the video, and it can hopefully be helpful to other people. You can like and follow Power to Change Students to keep up with what our Ultimate Questions Apologetics team is doing. And again, if you want us to come speak at your university group or your high school group or your youth group or church or something like that, just hit us up with a message. We'd love to get in touch with you. And this is our last week. All these videos will be available on the Ultimate Questions YouTube page. So if you're interested in watching these videos, maybe you missed some of them or you're interested in showing them to other people, they will be available on our YouTube page coming up. So we'll be sharing that as well. And so, yeah, thank you very much for joining me for the Ask Me Anything series. Hopefully we can do this again in the future sometime.